The prayer was barely a whisper when Ethan heard it, standing outside the small window of the weathered homestead just north of Red Bluff, California, his horse tied to the fence post nearby. He had only stopped because his canteen was dry and he'd seen the water pump in the yard, but the sound of a woman's broken voice had frozen him in place, one boot already lifted toward the porch steps. The year was 1878, and in all his 26 years of living, Ethan Kepler had never heard such raw sorrow wrapped in hope the way this woman's prayer carried both. He should have walked away. A decent man would have mounted his horse and ridden off toward Sacramento, where he'd been heading to sell the cattle he'd driven up from the southern ranges. Instead, something about that voice held him there, dust coating his worn leather chaps and sweat still drying on his shirt from the long ride. Through the window, he could see her kneeling beside a wooden cradle, her hands clasped so tight her knuckles had gone white. Her dark blonde hair hung loose down her back, and even from this distance, he could see her shoulders shaking. Ethan cleared his throat and knocked on the door frame, loud enough to be heard but gentle enough not to startle. The prayer stopped immediately. He heard rustling, quick footsteps, and then the door cracked open. A pair of red-rimmed blue eyes stared out at him, and he found himself looking at a woman probably around 24, with a face that might have been beautiful if it wasn't so hollowed out by grief. "Madam," he said, pulling his hat from his head, "I apologize for the intrusion. I was hoping I might trouble you for some water from your pump. My canteen ran dry about 5 miles back." She studied him for a long moment, taking in his dusty clothes, the worn gun belt at his hip, and the cattle horse tied to her fence. Finally, she nodded and stepped back, opening the door wider. "The pump's around the side of the house. Help yourself." "Thank you, madam." He turned to go, then hesitated. "Are you all right? I couldn't help but hear." Her jaw tightened, and for a moment he thought she might slam the door in his face. Instead, she just said quietly, "I'm fine. Thank you for your concern." But she wasn't fine, and they both knew it. Ethan nodded anyway and went to fill his canteen, the pump handle creaking in the afternoon heat. The little homestead was clearly struggling. The fence needed mending, the barn door hung crooked on its hinges, and the vegetable garden out back looked like it was losing a battle with the dry California summer. He'd seen enough dying homesteads to recognize one. He should have left then, filled his canteen, tipped his hat, and ridden on. But something made him walk back to the door and knock again. When she opened it this time, she looked more resigned than surprised. "Madam, I noticed your fence is in need of some repair, and that barn door looks like it's about to fall off. If you've got some tools, I could fix those things for you. Wouldn't take more than a few hours, and I don't need payment. Just seems like you could use the help." Willa Brennan stared at the stranger on her porch, trying to figure out his angle. Men didn't just offer help for nothing, not in her experience. Her late husband had taught her that much before he'd drunk himself to death 6 months ago, leaving her alone on this failing homestead with nothing but debts and a broken heart. "Why?" she asked bluntly. He met her eyes, and she saw something honest there. "Because I was raised that when you see someone struggling, you help if you can. And because I heard your prayer, and I figure anyone praying that hard over an empty cradle deserves a little kindness from a stranger." Heat flooded her face, embarrassment and anger mixing together. "You had no right to listen." "No, madam, I didn't, and I apologize for that, but the offer stands anyway. I can fix your fence and that barn door, and then I'll be on my way. You'll never see me again." Willa wanted to tell him to leave. She wanted to slam the door and go back inside and continue the grief that had become her constant companion. But she also knew that fence needed fixing before winter came, and she didn't have the money to hire help, and her pride wouldn't hold out forever against practicality. "The tools are in the barn," she said finally. "I don't have money to pay you. Didn't ask for any." He put his hat back on and headed toward the barn, and Willa closed the door and leaned against it, wondering what she'd just agreed to. For the next 3 hours, she tried to ignore the sound of hammering and sawing outside. She busied herself with mending clothes, with grinding corn for bread, with anything that would keep her hands occupied and her mind away from that empty cradle in the corner of the room. But her eyes kept drifting to it, to the little quilt she'd sewn herself, to the wooden toys her husband had carved back when he'd still been sober enough to hold tools steady. She'd been married at 20 to Robert Brennan, a man 10 years her senior who'd seemed steady and reliable. For a year, things had been good. They'd worked the homestead together, talked about filling that cradle he'd built, made plans for the future. Then he'd started drinking, a little at first, then more, until the bottle became more important than anything else. The homestead had suffered. She'd suffered. And when she'd finally gotten pregnant last year, she'd thought maybe it would change him. Maybe the baby would be the reason he needed to put down the bottle. But she'd lost the baby at 4 months, and Robert had drunk even harder, and 3 months after that, he'd fallen off his horse while drunk and broken his neck. The doctor in Red Bluff had called it an accident. Willa called it inevitable. Now she was alone with an empty cradle and a failing homestead, and a grief so deep, she sometimes couldn't breathe around it. The prayer the cowboy had overheard had become her daily ritual, a desperate plea to God that someday, somehow, she'd have a child to fill that cradle, that her life would mean more than this endless cycle of loss and loneliness. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find the cowboy standing there, hat in hand again, his face streaked with dust and sweat. "Fence is mended and the barn doors fixed," he said. "I also noticed you've got some loose boards on your porch. If you've got a few more nails, I could secure those too." "You've done enough," Willa said, but her voice came out softer than she intended. "Thank you. It wasn't any trouble." He glanced past her into the house, and she saw his eyes land on the cradle. Something shifted in his expression, a gentleness that made her throat tight. "I meant what I said earlier, about that prayer. I hope someday you get what you're asking for." "That's not likely," she said, the words bitter on her tongue. "I'm 24 years old, widowed with a homestead that's barely making it and no prospects for anything better. That cradle will probably stay empty." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that made her heart stop. "Maybe not. Maybe someday, if you wanted, we could fill it together." She stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "What?" He looked as surprised as she felt, like the words had come out without his permission. "I'm sorry, that was too forward. I should go." "Wait." She didn't know why she said it, but suddenly she didn't want him to leave. "What's your name?" "Ethan Kepler, madam." "I'm Willa Brennan." She hesitated, then added, "Would you like some water? Real water, I mean, not from the pump. I have some cool in the well house." The surprise on his face was almost comical. "I'd appreciate that." She led him around to the small well house, where she kept milk and butter and whatever else needed to stay cool. She pulled up the bucket with the water jug in it and poured him a tin cup full. He drank it down in long gulps, and she found herself watching the way his throat worked, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck where it was damp with sweat. "So you're a cattle driver?" she asked, needing to fill the silence. "Among other things." "I've got a small ranch down near Bakersfield, but it's not much. I drive cattle up to Sacramento a few times a year to sell, and that keeps me going." He handed the cup back to her. "What about you? How long have you been working this place alone?" 6 months, since my husband died." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't push. "That's a long time to handle everything by yourself." "I manage." But even as she said it, she knew it was only half true. She was managing, but barely, and she had no idea how she'd make it through another year. Ethan looked around the property, taking in all the things she knew needed work. "You need help, Mrs. Brennan. Real help, not just a stranger fixing your fence. This place is too much for one person." "I know that." Her voice came out sharper than she meant. "But I don't have choices. I can't afford to hire help, and I won't sell this land. It's all I have left." "Then let me help you," she laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You just said you were heading to Sacramento. Why would you stay here?" "Because I heard your prayer, and I made you an offer, and maybe God put me on this road today for a reason." He met her eyes, and she saw he was serious. "I could stay for a while, help you get this place back in shape. In return, you could feed me and give me a place to sleep." "The barn would be fine." "That's insane. You don't even know me." "No, but I know what it's like to be alone and struggling, and I know that sometimes people need help, even if they're too proud to ask for it." Willa wanted to refuse. Every practical bone in her body said this was foolish, that she couldn't trust a stranger, that he probably had ulterior motives. But she was so tired of doing everything alone, and the homestead was failing faster than she could fix it, and something about this man made her feel like maybe, just maybe, he was telling the truth. "1 week," she said finally. "You can stay for 1 week, help me with the repairs that need doing most urgently, and then you go on to Sacramento. I'll feed you and you can sleep in the barn, but that's all this is. Help, nothing more." 1 week, he agreed. "And Mrs. Brennan, I meant what I said about filling that cradle someday. I know it was forward and I know we're strangers, but I felt something when I heard your prayer. Like maybe we were meant to meet. And if nothing else comes of this week, at least you'll know that someone out there heard you and cared enough to stop." She didn't trust herself to speak, so she just nodded and led him back to the barn, showing him where he could bed down and where the feed for his horse was stored. Then she went back to the house and stood in the doorway, watching him unsaddle his horse, and wondered what on earth she'd just agreed to. That first week changed something fundamental in both of them, though neither would admit it at the time. Ethan worked from sunup to sundown, repairing everything that needed fixing. He mended the barn, patched the roof where it leaked, reinforced the chicken coop that had been losing birds to foxes, and helped Willa shore up the irrigation channels to her vegetable garden. In return, she cooked meals that were better than anything he'd eaten on the trail and began to talk to him in the evenings when the work was done. She learned he was 26, born in Missouri but raised in California after his parents had come west when he was young. His father had been a cattle rancher, and Ethan had learned the trade from him before striking out on his own at 20. He'd never been married, never even come close, because he'd been too focused on building his ranch to think much about settling down. He learned she'd grown up in Red Bluff, the daughter of a seamstress and a shopkeeper who'd both died of fever when she was 18. She'd married Robert because she'd been alone and scared, and he'd seemed like stability. She didn't tell him about the drinking at first, just said the marriage had been difficult, and Ethan was gentleman enough not to press for details. By the end of that first week, the homestead looked better than it had in months, and Willa had to admit she'd grown used to having Ethan around. He was quiet but not sullen, hard-working without complaint, and he had a gentleness about him that made her feel safe in a way she hadn't in years. "Your week is up," she said on the 7th evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the California hills. "I suppose you'll be heading to Sacramento tomorrow." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "I could stay another week. There's still plenty that needs doing. I can't pay you." Still not asking for payment. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something in his eyes that made her heart race. "Why are you really staying, Ethan?" He met her gaze steadily. "Because I like it here. Because I like you." And because I think maybe that thing I said about filling your cradle together wasn't just something that slipped out. I think maybe I meant it. You barely know me. Then let me get to know you. Let me stay, help you save this place and see what happens. If after a month you want me gone, I'll go. But Willa, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since I heard that prayer. I know it's fast, and I know it probably sounds crazy, but I believe God put me here for a reason. She should have said no. She should have sent him away and gone back to her lonely existence. But the truth was, she didn't want to. In 1 week, Ethan had become something she'd never expected, a possibility of a different kind of future. Another month, she said finally. But Ethan, you need to understand something. I'm not ready for anything beyond friendship. I'm still grieving my baby, still trying to figure out how to live without all the plans I'd made. If you stay, it has to be with the understanding that I might never be ready for more. That's fair, he said quietly. I can wait. And if friendship is all you can give, then that's enough. It was a lie, and they both knew it, but it was the lie they needed to tell themselves to justify what was already growing between them. The weeks that followed established a rhythm that felt almost like a real life. Ethan worked the homestead during the day while Willa tended the house and the garden. They ate meals together, talked in the evenings, and slowly, carefully, began to share the pieces of themselves they'd kept hidden. She told him about Robert's drinking, about the fights and the fear, and the way she'd felt trapped in her own life. She told him about the baby, about how she'd felt it move inside her, and then suddenly it had stopped. And the doctor had told her there was nothing to be done, and she'd delivered a tiny son who'd never taken a breath. She told him how Robert had gotten drunk that night and stayed drunk, and how she'd hated him and grieved him in equal measure when he died. He told her about growing up poor, about watching his father work himself to death trying to make the ranch profitable. He told her about the loneliness of the trail, about nights spent under the stars wondering if there was more to life than cattle and dust. He told her he'd always wanted a family, but had never found a woman who understood the hard life of ranching, who could see past the dirt and sweat to the man underneath. I see you, Willa said one evening, the words quiet but certain. I see you, Ethan. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and she let him, and something shifted between them that couldn't be taken back. But it wasn't all easy. There were days when grief overwhelmed her, when she'd look at that empty cradle and break down sobbing, and Ethan would hold her and say nothing because there were no words that could fix it. There were days when he'd get frustrated with the endless work, with the way the homestead seemed to fight against every improvement, and she'd see the flash of temper in his eyes before he reined it in and went back to work. One morning in early September, nearly 2 months after Ethan had first arrived, Willa woke to find him packing his saddlebags. Her heart dropped into her stomach. "You're leaving," he looked up, and she saw the conflict in his eyes. "I have to go to Sacramento. The cattle drive I was supposed to make in June never happened, and I'm losing money every day I stay here. I have to sell the cattle from my ranch or I won't be able to keep it." "Oh." She tried to keep her voice neutral, but she knew she failed. "Of course, you should go. Come with me." She stared at him. "What? Come with me to Sacramento? It's a 4-day ride there, maybe 2 or 3 days to sell the cattle, 4 days back. We could make it there and back before the end of the month." He crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "Willa, I don't want to leave you here. I don't want to be away from you. Come with me. I can't just leave the homestead." "Why not? We'll hire someone in Red Bluff to check on the animals while we're gone. It's only going to be 10 days at most. The place will be fine." She wanted to say yes. The word was right there on her tongue, eager to escape. But fear held it back, fear that if she went with him, if she took this step, she'd be admitting that he'd become more than just help, more than just a friend. Willa. He cupped her face in his hands, his calloused thumbs gentle against her cheeks. I'm falling in love with you, I probably already have. And I think maybe you feel something for me too. Come with me. Let's take this trip together, see Sacramento, have an adventure. And when we come back, maybe we can start talking about the future instead of just surviving day to day. I'm scared, she whispered. I know, so am I, but I think what we have is worth being scared for. She closed her eyes, felt his forehead rest against hers, and made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Okay, I'll come with you. The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise, and when he kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise, she felt something inside her chest crack open, letting light in for the first time in what felt like forever. They left the next morning after making arrangements with a neighbor to check on the homestead. Willa rode behind Ethan on his horse, her arms wrapped around his waist, her cheek pressed against his back. They made good time, following the Sacramento River north through the valley, camping under the stars at night. The first night, lying on their separate bedrolls with the fire crackling between them, Ethan said, "Tell me something you've never told anyone else." Willa was quiet for a long moment. I used to be angry at God. After I lost the baby, after Robert died, I was so angry that I couldn't pray for months. When you heard me that day, that was the first time I'd prayed in half a year. I felt like God had abandoned me, like nothing I did mattered because he was just going to take everything away anyway. Do you still feel that way? No. I think maybe God was just waiting for the right time to send me help. I think maybe he sent me you. Across the fire, she saw Ethan's eyes reflecting the flames. I think maybe he sent me you too. I was starting to think I'd spend my whole life alone, that I wasn't meant for family or happiness, just work and survival. Then I heard you praying and everything changed. Ethan, that thing you said about filling the cradle together someday, did you mean it? Every word. He sat up, leaning forward so she could see his face clearly. Willa, I want to marry you. I want to combine our homesteads, build something real together. I want to fill that cradle and then build more cradles, and I want to grow old with you. I know it's fast, and I know you might not be ready, but I needed you to know that's what I want. That's what I'm working toward. She sat up too, her heart hammering. I want that too. I'm terrified of it, but I want it. I want you. Then when we get back from Sacramento, let's get married. Small ceremony in Red Bluff, just us and whoever will stand as witnesses, and then we start our life together for real. Yes, the word came out breathless, excited, sure. Yes, Ethan. Let's do that. He moved around the fire and pulled her into his arms, and they kissed under the stars, tasting possibility and promise, and everything they'd both been too afraid to hope for. Sacramento was overwhelming after the quiet of the homestead. The streets were crowded with people, wagons, horses, all the bustle of a city that was still growing and changing. Ethan handled his business with efficiency, selling his cattle for a good price and making contacts for future sales. In between, he showed Willa the city, bought her a new dress from a shop that made her feel like royalty, and took her to a restaurant where they sat at a real table with real plates and ate food someone else had cooked. Is this what it's like? She asked, watching the people pass by outside the window. Living in a city, it can be, but it's not for me. I like the open space, the quiet. I like knowing my neighbors even if they are miles away. He reached across the table and took her hand. What about you? Do you ever wish you lived somewhere bigger? No. Red Bluff is enough city for me. I like the homestead, even with all its troubles. It feels like mine in a way nothing else ever has. Then we'll stay there. We'll build it up, make it profitable, make it home. Together. Together, he agreed and squeezed her hand. On their last night in Sacramento, Ethan took her to a small church and asked the minister if he'd be willing to marry them. The old man looked at them with wise eyes and asked if they were sure. They were both dusty from the trail, far from home and clearly moving fast. "I've never been more sure of anything," Ethan said. "Neither have I," Willa added. The minister smiled and agreed, and right there in that small church with only the minister and his wife as witnesses, Ethan Kepler and Willa Brennan were married. There were no flowers, no fancy clothes, no family to watch. Just two people who'd found each other in the midst of their separate griefs and decided to build something new together. That night, in a boarding house room that Ethan paid extra for, they consummated their marriage with a tenderness that brought tears to Willa's eyes. He was gentle and patient, and when it was over, she lay in his arms and felt, for the first time since losing her baby, like maybe her life was going to be okay. More than okay. Maybe it was going to be good. "I love you," she whispered against his chest. "I love you too," he said into her hair. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving it to you." They headed back to Red Bluff the next day, husband and wife, partners in every sense. The journey back felt shorter somehow, or maybe Willa was just happier, more content than she'd been in years. They talked about the future, about combining Ethan's ranch near Bakersfield with her homestead, about building a bigger house, about the children they hoped to have. "I want lots of children," Ethan said as they rode. "A whole house full of noise and chaos and love. I want that too." "But Ethan, what if I can't? What if what happened before happens again?" He pulled the horse to a stop and turned to look at her. "Then we'll face it together. And if we can't have children of our own, we'll figure out another way. Maybe we'll find children who need a home, or maybe we'll pour our love into nieces and nephews and neighbors. But Willa, I married you because I love you, not because of how many children you can give me. Whatever happens, we face it as a team." She kissed him then, right there on the side of the trail, and felt the last of her fear start to crumble. When they arrived back at the homestead, it was late afternoon, and the golden light made everything look warm and welcoming. The neighbor who'd been checking on things reported that all was well, and after he left, Ethan and Willa stood together on the porch, looking out at their land. "Welcome home, Mrs. Kepler," Ethan said. "Mrs. Kepler." It sounded strange and wonderful all at once. "Welcome home, husband." That night, they moved Ethan's things from the barn into the house, and he slept in her bed for the first time in the place that had witnessed so much of her grief. But it felt different now, transformed by his presence, by their shared hope for the future. In the weeks that followed, they worked on creating a real life together. Ethan made trips down to his ranch near Bakersfield, bringing back his best breeding stock and selling the rest. He and Willa decided to focus the homestead on raising cattle and growing hay to sell to other ranchers, a combination that would provide steady income without requiring more labor than the two of them could handle. The work was hard but satisfying. They fell into an easy rhythm, learning each other's strengths and weaknesses, figuring out how to work together without stepping on each other's toes. In the evenings, they'd collapse into bed exhausted but content, and Ethan would hold Willa close and they'd talk about their dreams until sleep claimed them. By December, Willa began to suspect she might be pregnant. She didn't say anything at first, too afraid to hope, too scared of another loss. But as the weeks passed and the signs became unmistakable, she finally told Ethan one evening as they sat by the fire, "I think I'm carrying a child." He went very still, and when he looked at her, she saw hope and fear warring in his eyes. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor. I'm 3 weeks late and I've been sick in the mornings and I just feel different. Ethan, I'm terrified." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "I know, but we're going to get through this." Tomorrow we'll go into Red Bluff and see the doctor. Make sure you and the baby are healthy. And then we're going to take this one day at a time, and we're going to pray, and we're going to believe that this time, things will be different. The next day, Dr. Harrison in Red Bluff confirmed what Willa already knew. She was pregnant, probably about 2 months along, and from what he could tell, everything looked good. He gave her instructions about rest and nutrition, warned her about the dangers to watch for, and told her to come back monthly for checkups. "When did you lose your previous baby?" he asked gently. "At 4 months. Then we'll watch you extra carefully around that time. Mrs. Kepler, I won't lie to you. There's always risk, but many women who lose a baby go on to have healthy pregnancies later. Try not to borrow trouble from tomorrow." They left the doctor's office with Ethan's arm around Willa's shoulders, both of them quiet with the weight of hope and fear. That night, they knelt together beside the empty cradle, and Ethan prayed aloud for the first time since Willa had known him. "God, we're scared. We're excited and hopeful and terrified all at once. Please protect this baby. Please let Willa carry it safe and healthy to term. Please give us the family we're both longing for, and whatever happens, help us face it together with faith and strength. Amen." "Amen," Willa whispered, tears streaming down her face. The winter months were anxious ones. Every day that passed was a victory, but also a reminder of how close they were to the time when Willa had lost her previous baby. Ethan treated her like spun glass, constantly worried she was working too hard or not eating enough. She found it annoying and touching in equal measure. "I'm pregnant, not dying," she said one day when he tried to take a basket of laundry out of her hands. "I can still work. I know, I just want you to be careful. I am being careful. But Ethan, I can't spend 9 months sitting in a chair doing nothing. I'll go crazy." They compromised. She'd continue doing lighter work but leave the heavy lifting to him. She'd rest when she felt tired and not push herself beyond what felt comfortable. And Ethan would try to be less hovering, though they both knew that was a promise he'd struggle to keep. In mid-February, they passed the 4-month mark. Willa had been tense for weeks leading up to it, barely sleeping, checking constantly for any sign that something was wrong. But the day came and went, and she was still pregnant, and the baby was still moving inside her, and for the first time, she let herself really believe this might work. "We made it," she said to Ethan that night, crying with relief. "We made it past when I lost him." "We did," he said, his own eyes wet. "Our baby is strong. You're strong. We're going to make it all the way." As her belly grew rounder and the baby's movements became more pronounced, Willa felt her fear slowly transform into joy. She started making plans, sewing little clothes, washing and rewashing the quilt in the cradle. Ethan built a bigger cradle, just in case, and started working on a rocking chair that he carved with careful detail during the evenings. The people of Red Bluff, who'd watched Willa's first pregnancy and knew about her loss, were cautiously happy for her. The women at church gave advice and hand-me-down baby clothes. The men clapped Ethan on the back and made jokes about sleepless nights. It felt like the whole community was holding its breath along with them, hoping this time would be different. In June, as the California heat began to build and her due date approached, Willa found herself increasingly uncomfortable but also increasingly excited. The baby was active, constantly moving and kicking, and Dr. Harrison said everything looked good. They'd made it to the final stretch. "What do you want to name it?" Ethan asked one evening as they sat on the porch, Willa's feet propped up on his lap as he rubbed them. "If it's a boy, I want to name him Thomas after my father. If it's a girl, maybe Rose. I've always loved that name. Thomas Kepler or Rose Kepler, I like both of those." He placed his hand on her belly and felt the baby kick. "Hello in there, Thomas or Rose." Your mama and papa can't wait to meet you." Willa felt tears prick her eyes, as they seemed to do constantly these days. "Ethan, thank you." "For what?" "For stopping that day. For listening to my prayer, for staying, for loving me, for giving me hope again." He leaned forward and kissed her soft and sweet. "Willa, you saved me as much as I saved you. Before I met you, I was just surviving, just going through the motions. You gave me a reason to build a real life, to want more than just cattle and dust. You gave me a home." "We gave each other a home," she corrected. "Yeah," he agreed with a smile. "We did." 3 weeks later, on a hot July morning in 1879, Willa went into labor. Ethan rode hard into Red Bluff to fetch Dr. Harrison and the midwife, then paced the porch like a caged animal while the women worked inside. He could hear Willa's cries of pain and had to fight the urge to burst in there and demand to help somehow. The sun was setting when he finally heard a different sound, the thin wail of a newborn baby. His knees nearly buckled with relief. He stood frozen, waiting until finally the midwife came out with a smile on her face. "You have a son, Mr. Kepler, a healthy baby boy, and your wife did beautifully." Ethan didn't remember moving, but suddenly he was inside at Willa's bedside, staring down at the tiny bundle in her arms. She looked exhausted but radiant, her face streaked with sweat and tears, her eyes shining as she gazed down at their son. "Thomas," she said softly. "Thomas Kepler." "Ethan, look. We did it. We filled the cradle." He sank onto the edge of the bed, his hand trembling as he touched the baby's tiny head. "He's perfect. You're perfect. Willa, I've never been so scared or so happy in my entire life." "Me neither." She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw everything they'd been through, all the grief and fear and hope that had brought them to this moment. "We prayed for this. You heard me praying and you offered to help me fill that cradle, and here he is. Our miracle." The baby, as if aware he was being discussed, opened his eyes and stared up at them with that unfocused newborn gaze. Ethan felt something in his chest expand so suddenly it almost hurt, a love so fierce and protective it took his breath away. "I'm going to be the best father I can be," he promised quietly. "I'm going to love him and protect him and teach him everything I know. And when he's old enough, I'm going to tell him the story of how I met his mother, how I heard her prayer and knew I was meant to stay." "That's a good story," Willa said with a tired smile. "Though maybe we'll wait until he's a bit older to mention the part about filling the cradle." Ethan laughed, the sound watery with unshed tears. "Maybe so, Doctor." Harrison declared both mother and baby healthy before he left, with instructions for Willa to rest for the next few weeks and let Ethan handle everything. For once, she didn't argue. The birth had taken everything out of her, and she was content to stay in bed with Thomas, nursing him and sleeping and marveling at the fact that he was real, that he was here, that he was theirs. The first few weeks were exhausting in a new way. Thomas was a good baby for the most part, but he still needed to eat every few hours, day and night. Willa and Ethan stumbled through those early days in a haze of sleeplessness, learning how to care for this tiny person who depended on them for everything. But there were moments of pure magic too. The first time Thomas smiled, even though it was probably just gas. The way he'd curl his tiny hand around Ethan's finger and hold on tight. The sound of his breathing as he slept in the cradle that had waited so long for him. These moments made all the exhaustion worthwhile. By August, they'd fallen into something resembling a routine. Willa was recovering well, and Thomas was growing at a pace that Dr. Harrison said was perfect. The homestead work had fallen behind during those first weeks, but neighbors had stepped in to help, and slowly things were getting back on track. One evening, as they sat on the porch with Thomas asleep in Willa's arms, Ethan said, "I've been thinking." This place is doing well, but if we're going to raise a family here, we need to expand. Build a bigger house, add another bedroom or two for more children. Maybe hire some help so you're not working yourself into the ground. More children, Willa raised an eyebrow. This one is barely 2 months old. I know. I'm not saying right now, but someday. You said you wanted lots of children, and so do I, and this time I don't think we need to be as scared. You did it once, you can do it again. She looked down at Thomas, at his perfect little face, and felt a surge of hope. I'd like that. A big family, lots of noise and chaos, like you said. But Ethan, even if Thomas ends up being our only child, I'm grateful. I'm so grateful for what we have. So am I. He reached over and ran a gentle finger down Thomas's cheek. But I have a feeling he won't be alone for long. Something tells me this cradle is going to stay busy. He was right. 14 months after Thomas was born, Willa gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, just as they'd planned. And 2 years after that, another son named James arrived. The cradle that had once sat empty was now in constant use, and Ethan had to build a bigger house just to fit their growing family. Through it all, through sleepless nights and teething babies and the endless work of running a homestead and raising children, Willa and Ethan's love for each other only grew stronger. They'd started as strangers, brought together by a prayer and a promise, and built something real and lasting. The story of how they met became family legend. As the children grew, they'd beg to hear it again and again, how Papa had been riding by and heard Mama praying over an empty cradle, how he'd offered to help fill it, how they'd fallen in love and built a family together. "Tell us again, Mama," Rose would say, snuggled between her parents on the porch as the sun set over the California hills. And Willa would smile and begin. "It was a hot day in June, and I was kneeling beside an empty cradle, praying for a miracle. And then I heard a knock at the door, and there stood your father, dusty from the trail and asking for water. I didn't know it then, but my prayer was being answered in that very moment." "And then what happened?" Thomas would ask, even though he knew the story by heart. "Then your father said something that changed everything," Willa would continue, reaching over to take Ethan's hand. "He said, 'Let's fill it together someday.' And we did. We filled it with you and Rose and James and all the love we could hold." "That's my favorite story," James would declare from Ethan's lap. "Mine too," Ethan would say, pulling Willa close for a kiss. "Mine too." By the time Thomas was 10 years old, the homestead had transformed into a thriving ranch that was known throughout the region. Ethan's cattle business had grown successful enough that they'd been able to hire 2 ranch hands and expand their grazing land. Willa had started a small business making quilts that sold well in Sacramento, bringing in extra income and giving her a creative outlet beyond the daily work of the ranch. The house Ethan had built was large and comfortable, with 4 bedrooms and a real kitchen with a wood stove that made Willa's life so much easier than the old one had. The barn was solid and well-maintained, the fences stood straight and strong, and the vegetable garden flourished under Willa's care. But more than the physical improvements, it was the sense of family and belonging that made the place special. The sound of children's laughter filled the air, and neighbors knew they could stop by any time and be welcomed with coffee and friendship. The church in Red Bluff had become their community, and Willa and Ethan were known as a couple who'd overcome hardship to build something beautiful together. One Sunday after church, an older woman approached Willa with tears in her eyes. "I just wanted to thank you," she said. "My daughter lost a baby last year, and she's been struggling with grief and fear. But I told her your story about the empty cradle and how your husband heard your prayer, and it gave her hope. She's expecting again now, and instead of being paralyzed with fear, she's choosing to believe it's going to work out. You gave her that." Willa felt her own tears rise. Tell her I'm praying for her, and tell her that fear is normal, but it doesn't have to win. She can be scared and hopeful at the same time. Stories like that became common as word of their journey spread. They became a symbol of hope for others who were struggling, proof that loss didn't have to be the end of the story, that new beginnings were possible even after profound grief. When Thomas turned 12 and began helping more seriously with the ranch work, Ethan started teaching him everything he knew about cattle and land management. Rose, at 10, showed more interest in her mother's quilting business and was already creating her own designs. James, at 8, was still figuring out where his interests lay, but he had his father's gift with horses and spent hours in the barn grooming and training their stock. Watching their children grow, Willa sometimes still couldn't quite believe this was her life. There were moments when she'd stand in the doorway of their home and just look around at the evidence of everything they'd built, the noise and mess and beautiful chaos of a family, and feel overwhelmed with gratitude. One evening, after the children were in bed, she and Ethan sat on the porch as they had countless times before. It had been 13 years since the day he'd knocked on her door, 13 years since he'd heard her prayer and changed the course of both their lives. "You ever regret it?" she asked. "Stopping that day, staying here instead of going to Sacramento like you'd planned." Ethan turned to look at her, surprise evident on his face. "Regret it? Willa, that was the best decision I ever made. Why would you even ask that? I don't know. Sometimes I think about how different your life would have been if you'd just ridden past, if you hadn't stopped for water. Different, yes, but not better. Never better." He took her hand, his thumb rubbing circles on her palm the way he'd done for years. "Willa, everything good in my life came from that decision. You, our children, this home we've built. I was half alive before I met you, just going through the motions. You gave me purpose, love, family. You gave me everything that matters. You gave me those things too. I was drowning in grief when you found me. If you hadn't stopped, if you hadn't offered to help, I don't know if I would have survived much longer. The homestead was failing and I was failing with it." "We saved each other," Ethan said, the same thing they'd told each other years ago. "That's what love does. It saves us from the loneliness and the grief and the fear that we're going to be alone forever." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the night, the crickets chirping and the distant lowing of cattle. Finally, Willa said, "I'm pregnant again." Ethan's head whipped around so fast she almost laughed. "What? I'm pregnant? About 6 weeks along, I think. I wasn't sure if I should be excited or worried about telling you. I know 3 children is already a lot and we're not exactly young anymore." "I'm 37 and you're 39. "Excited," Ethan said immediately, a grin spreading across his face. "I'm excited. Willa, this is wonderful news. Are you worried? About the pregnancy, I mean. A little. I'm older now and that comes with risks. But mostly I'm excited too. I love being a mother, and I love our family, and one more blessing sounds pretty good to me." He pulled her close and kissed her soundly. "One more blessing," he agreed, "though I think we might need to add another bedroom to the house. Or maybe Rose and the new baby can share if it's a girl. Or Thomas can bunk with James if it's a boy." They talked late into the night about names and plans and how to tell the children. And later, lying in bed with Ethan's hand resting protectively on her still flat belly, Willa thought about that empty cradle all those years ago, about the desperate prayer she'd offered up, about the cowboy who'd heard it and offered to fill it together someday. They'd done more than fill one cradle. They'd built a whole life together, full of love and children and purpose. And now they were adding to it again, creating another life, another blessing. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Ethan murmured sleepily. "For stopping. For staying, for loving me." "Best thing I ever did," he said, pulling her closer. "Best thing I ever did." The pregnancy progressed smoothly despite Willa's age. Dr. Harrison monitored her carefully, but there were no complications, and by the time she started showing, the whole family was excited about the new arrival. Thomas, now 12 and trying to act grown up, pretended to be unaffected but was caught more than once asking his mother when the baby would arrive. Rose was thrilled at the possibility of a sister, and James just wanted to know if the baby would be able to play with him right away. In March of 1892, as California transitioned from winter to spring, Willa gave birth to another daughter. They named her Grace, because that's what she felt like, an extra measure of grace they hadn't expected but were grateful for. This time, the birth was easier than the others had been, and Willa recovered quickly. Having 3 older children meant there were plenty of hands to help, and Rose in particular took to her role as big sister with enthusiasm that was both helpful and occasionally overwhelming. "Let your mother rest," Ethan would say when Rose wanted to hold Grace for the 100th time that day. "But Papa, I'm helping," Rose would protest. "You are. But babies need their mothers most of all, and Mama needs sleep." They'd worked out a system over the years, Ethan and Willa, a partnership that meant they shared the load of both running the ranch and raising the family. He was as comfortable changing a diaper as she was herding cattle, and both of them took turns with night feedings and daily chores. It wasn't always easy, and there were definitely arguments and frustrations along the way, but underlying everything was a deep love and respect that carried them through. As Grace grew from infant to toddler, the ranch continued to prosper. Ethan's reputation as a fair and knowledgeable cattle rancher had spread, and they had no shortage of buyers for their stock. Willa's quilting business had grown to the point where she had more orders than she could fill on her own, so she'd started teaching Rose the craft, and mother and daughter spent many happy hours together working on designs. Thomas, at 13, had grown tall and strong and was now doing a man's work on the ranch. He had his father's steady temperament and his mother's quick mind, and Ethan often said he'd make a fine rancher someday. James, at 10, was the wild one, always getting into mischief but with such a good heart that it was hard to stay mad at him for long. By the time Grace turned 3, the Kepler family was well established in Red Bluff society. Ethan served on the town council, helping to make decisions about infrastructure and development. Willa was involved with the church and various charitable organizations, using her own experiences with loss and recovery to help others going through hard times. One day in the summer of 1895, a young woman came to their door, her eyes red from crying, her body thin and worn. "Mrs. Kepler, my name is Sarah. The women at church said you might be able to help me." Willa invited her in and sat her down with coffee and food. The story that came out was heartbreaking and familiar. Sarah had been married young to a man who'd seemed good but turned cruel. She'd lost a baby, then another, and her husband blamed her for it and treated her terribly. She'd finally found the courage to leave him, but now she was alone with nowhere to go and no way to support herself. "You can stay here," Willa said without hesitation. "We have room, and we could use help with the house and the children. In exchange, you'll have a place to sleep, food to eat, and time to heal and figure out what comes next." Sarah looked at her with disbelief. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" "Because someone did it for me once. Not in exactly the same way, but close enough. My husband heard me praying over an empty cradle and offered to help, and that kindness saved my life. Now it's my turn to help someone else." Sarah stayed with them for 8 months, and in that time, she transformed. The haunted look left her eyes, she gained weight and color in her cheeks, and she began to smile and laugh again. She was wonderful with the children, patient and kind, and she became part of the family in a way that felt natural and right. Eventually, she met a blacksmith in town, a widower with 2 young children of his own who needed a mother. They courted carefully and married after 6 months, and Sarah moved into town to start her new life. But she remained close to the Keplers, and her children and theirs grew up as friends. "That's what we're meant to do," Ethan said to Willa after Sarah's wedding. "Take the blessings we've received and pass them on to others. Help fill the empty cradles, literal and figurative." "I agree. We've been so blessed, Ethan. It feels right to share that with others." Over the years, they helped several other women and families, offering temporary shelter, employment, or just friendship and support when it was needed. Their home became known as a place of refuge and hope, and Willa's story of the empty cradle and the cowboy who helped fill it became a beacon for others struggling with loss. As the 19th century drew to a close and the new century began, the Kepler children grew into young adults. Thomas married at 21 to a rancher's daughter from the next county over, and they built a house on the northern portion of the Kepler land. Ethan deeded him that section as a wedding gift, and father and son worked the ranch as partners. Rose, at 19, had become a skilled quilter whose work was sought after throughout the region. She eventually opened a small shop in Red Bluff, selling not just quilts but also fabric and teaching classes to other women. She married at 22 to a banker's son and had 3 children of her own. James, true to his wild nature, became a horse trainer and spent several years traveling to different ranches, learning new techniques and building his reputation. He eventually returned to Red Bluff and started his own training business on the southern portion of the Kepler land, which Ethan deeded to him. Grace, the baby, grew into a beautiful young woman with her mother's compassion and her father's steady strength. She became a teacher in the Red Bluff school, beloved by her students and respected by their parents. By 1910, Ethan and Willa were in their mid-50s, and they'd been married for 32 years. Their hair had gone gray, their bodies had slowed down, but their love for each other remained as strong as ever. They'd handed off most of the day-to-day ranch work to Thomas and his family, content to serve as advisors and spend more time with their growing number of grandchildren. One evening, sitting on the porch that had witnessed so much of their life together, Willa said, "Do you remember that first day, when you knocked on my door asking for water?" "I remember everything about that day," Ethan said. "The way the sun was hitting your window, the sound of your prayer, the look in your eyes when you opened the door. I knew right then that my life was about to change." "Did you really? Or is that just a romantic memory?" "I really did. Not the details, maybe. I didn't know we'd get married and have 4 children and build this life together. But I knew you were important, that hearing that prayer wasn't an accident." Willa leaned her head on his shoulder. "I thought you were crazy. A stranger offering to fix my fence for free, saying he wanted to help fill my empty cradle someday. If you'd said that to me today, I'd think you were out of your mind." "Maybe I was," Ethan said with a laugh, "but it was the best kind of crazy." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over land they'd worked and loved for 3 decades. From inside the house, they could hear Grace moving around, preparing dinner. From the northern fields came the distant sound of cattle lowing. From the barn, they could hear James working with a particularly stubborn horse. This was their legacy, Willa thought. Not just the land or the cattle or the buildings, but the family they'd created, the love they'd shared, the hope they'd offered to others. That empty cradle all those years ago had been the starting point for all of this, a prayer that had been answered beyond anything she could have imagined. "Ethan, I'm glad you stopped for water that day. He squeezed her hand. "So am I, love, so am I." As they grew older still, into their 60s and beyond, Ethan and Willa settled into the comfortable rhythm of grandparenting and retirement. The ranch continued under Thomas's capable management, with James and his family contributing their expertise with the horses. Rose's shop thrived in town, and Grace had become principal of the school. The grandchildren loved spending time at the big house, begging their grandmother to tell the story of the empty cradle and the cowboy, listening with wide eyes to tales of the old days. Ethan would add his own embellishments, making Willa laugh with his increasingly dramatic retellings of their courtship. "It wasn't that romantic," she'd protest. "It absolutely was," he'd insist. "I was a cowboy in shining armor, riding up to save you. You were a dusty cattle driver asking for water." Same thing. The grandchildren would giggle and take sides, and Willa would shake her head in mock exasperation, but she loved every minute of it. This was what they'd built together, a family so large and loving and full of joy that sometimes it took her breath away. In 1920, when Willa was 66 and Ethan was 68, they celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary. The entire family gathered for a party that spilled out of the house and across the lawn, with grandchildren running everywhere and great-grandchildren toddling about. Thomas gave a speech about his parents' legacy. Rose presented them with a special quilt she'd made depicting scenes from their life together. And James brought out a horse he'd been training specifically for his father. Grace stood up last and said simply, "Mama and Papa, you taught us what love looks like. Not the fairy tale kind, but the real kind that works through grief and builds something beautiful. Thank you for showing us how to fill the empty spaces in our lives with hope and family and faith." There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Ethan and Willa looked at the quilt Rose had made. It showed scenes from their life. Ethan standing at the door of the homestead, the two of them on horseback riding to Sacramento, their wedding in the small church, each of their children as babies, the expanded house, and finally, the two of them as they were now, silver-haired and surrounded by family. "She captured it all," Willa said softly, running her hand over the intricate stitching. "She learned from the best," Ethan said. "Willa, we've had a good life, better than I ever dreamed possible. We have. And Ethan, if I had to do it all over again, I wouldn't change a single thing. Well, maybe the part where Robert died. I'd wish that he'd gotten help and lived, even if it meant you and I never met, because nobody deserves what he went through." "That's because you have a generous heart," Ethan said. "But I'm selfish enough to be glad things worked out the way they did, because it brought me to you. Not selfish. Human. We're both human, and we've done our best to build something good from the pieces we were given." As the years continued to pass, Willa's health began to decline. Nothing dramatic, just the slow wearing down of a body that had worked hard and lived fully. Her hands became too stiff for quilting, her legs too weak for long walks around the ranch. But her mind stayed sharp, and her love for Ethan and their family never wavered. In the spring of 1925, at the age of 71, Willa became very ill with pneumonia. Dr. Harrison, who'd retired years ago and passed his practice to a younger doctor, made a special visit to the ranch. He sat with Ethan outside Willa's room and said gently, "I think you need to prepare yourself. She's very weak, and at her age, pneumonia is often too much to fight." Ethan felt his world tilt. "How long? Days, maybe. A week at most if she's very strong, which she is. I'm sorry, Ethan. After everything you two have been through together, I wish the ending could be different." But Willa surprised them all. She fought the pneumonia with the same stubborn strength she'd shown throughout her life, and after 2 weeks of struggle, she began to improve. By the end of the month, she was sitting up in bed, demanding real food instead of broth, and complaining about being cooped up inside. "You're not allowed to scare me like that again," Ethan said, sitting beside her bed and holding her hand. "I'll do my best," she said with a weak smile. "But Ethan, we need to talk about what happens when one of us goes. We're old. We can't pretend we're going to live forever." "I don't want to talk about it." "I know, but we have to." She squeezed his hand. "When I die, and I will someday, I don't want you to give up. I want you to keep living, keep spending time with the children and grandchildren, keep telling our story. Promise me." "Willa." "Promise me, Ethan Kepler. Promise me you'll keep living." "I promise," he said, tears running down his weathered face. "But only if you promise me the same thing. If I go first, you keep living too." "Deal," she said, and they shook on it like business partners, which made them both laugh through their tears. Willa recovered from the pneumonia, but she never quite regained her full strength. She spent more time resting, less time on her feet, but she was still present for family gatherings and still wanted to hear all the news and gossip from town. Grace moved back into the big house to help care for her mother, and Ethan was grateful for the help even as he insisted on doing most of the caregiving himself. "You've been taking care of me for 47 years, Willa said one day as he helped her to the porch. "Don't you think it's time for a break?" "Never," he said firmly. "I made a promise to you the day we got married, for better or worse, in sickness and in health. I meant every word. I know you did. That's one of the many reasons I love you." They spent that summer on the porch together, watching the ranch go about its business, greeting grandchildren and great-grandchildren who came to visit, talking about their life and the memories they'd made. On warm nights, they'd stay out late, looking at the stars, and Ethan would tell Willa she was still as beautiful as the day he'd first seen her praying over that empty cradle. "You're a terrible liar," she'd say. "I'm not lying. You're beautiful to me, Willa. You always have been." In October, as California transitioned into autumn, Willa peacefully passed away in her sleep, with Ethan holding her hand. She was 71 years old, and she'd lived a full, rich life surrounded by love. The funeral was held in Red Bluff, and it seemed like the entire town turned out to pay their respects to the woman who touched so many lives with her kindness and strength. Ethan stood at her graveside, his children and grandchildren surrounding him, and said his final goodbye to the woman who'd saved him just as much as he'd saved her. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for every day, every moment, every blessing. I'll love you forever, Willa Kepler. I'll love you forever." True to his promise, Ethan kept living after Willa's death. It wasn't easy, not by any stretch, but he did it. He spent time with his family, told stories about their mother and grandmother, and made sure everyone knew the legacy Willa had left behind. He lived for 3 more years, years filled with love and family, and the satisfaction of a life well lived. In January of 1928, at the age of 76, Ethan passed away peacefully in his sleep, in the same bed he'd shared with Willa for nearly half a century. His last words, spoken to Grace, who was sitting with him, were, "Tell them the story. Tell them about the empty cradle and the cowboy who heard the prayer. Tell them how love saved us both." They buried him next to Willa in the Red Bluff Cemetery, under a large oak tree. The headstone reads simply, "Ethan Kepler, 1852–1928, beloved husband, father, and friend." Right beside it, Willa's headstone, "Willa Kepler, 1854–1925, beloved wife, mother, and friend." And between them, a small plaque that Thomas had commissioned, that read, "Their love filled the empty cradle and blessed the world." Years later, their great-great-grandchildren would still tell the story of Ethan and Willa, of the empty cradle and the cowboy who stopped for water and stayed for love. It became a family legend, passed down through generations, a reminder that sometimes the most profound changes in life come from the smallest moments of kindness. The ranch remained in the family, run by descendants who carried on the legacy of hard work, compassion, and faith that Ethan and Willa had established. The house was expanded and updated over the years, but parts of it remained the same, including the porch where two people had spent countless evenings talking and dreaming and building a life together. And in one corner of the living room, displayed in a place of honor, sat the original wooden cradle that had started it all. It had rocked 4 babies to sleep, then grandchildren when they visited, and eventually great-grandchildren. It had gone from empty symbol of grief to full representation of hope and family and the enduring power of love. Because in the end, that's what the story was really about, not just filling an empty cradle with babies, but filling empty hearts with love, empty lives with purpose, empty futures with hope. Ethan and Willa had done that for each other, and in doing so, they'd created a legacy that would outlast them both. Their story was proof that sometimes prayers are answered in unexpected ways, that strangers can become soulmates, and that love, when nurtured and protected and fought for, can transform everything. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth passing down through the generations. And so it was told, again and again, to children and grandchildren and all who needed to hear it. The story of a woman praying over an empty cradle, a cowboy who heard her and offered to help fill it together, and the beautiful life they built in the process. A life full of love, family, faith, and the kind of happiness that comes from 2 broken people finding each other and choosing to heal together. It was, in every way that mattered, a story worth living and a love worth celebrating. And though Ethan and Willa were gone, their legacy lived on in the family they'd created, in the lives they'd touched, and in the enduring truth that love, real love, has the power to fill every empty space in a human heart.